He wasn't an apostle. She didn't preach in synagogues. Yet, Paul entrusted her with one of the most important missions in early Christianity, delivering his letter to the Romans. Phoebe was more than a messenger. She was a leader, a benefactor, and a deaconess who played a vital role in the growth of the early church. Without her, one of the most influential books of the Bible may never have reached its destination. And yet, history barely speaks her name. Until now. This is the untold story of Phoebe, the woman who carried the gospel to Rome. In the grand narrative of the early church, some names shine like beacons: Paul, Peter, John. Their works, their writings, and their influence are woven into the very foundation of Christianity. But behind the great apostles, behind the sermons that shaped nations, there were quiet warriors of faith, moving unseen yet carrying the weight of history on their shoulders. Phoebe was one of them. For many, she is just a passing name in Romans 16, mentioned briefly in Paul's final greetings. But to those who look closely, she is so much more. She was a deaconess, a benefactor, a leader in the early church. She wasn't just recognized, she was commended by Paul himself. And most significantly, she carried one of the most important letters ever written, the Epistle to the Romans. Imagine the scene. Paul, writing from Corinth, pouring his heart into a message destined to shape Christian theology for centuries. Every word mattered. Every instruction held power. And when it was finished, when the final scroll was rolled and sealed, he had to choose someone to deliver it safely across treacherous roads, past Roman officials, into the heart of the empire itself, Rome. He didn't choose a prominent apostle. He didn't send a trained messenger. He chose Phoebe. What kind of woman must she have been for Paul to entrust her with such a mission? She wasn't a mere courier. She was an ambassador. She carried his words, but more than that, she carried the gospel itself. And yet, despite her significance, history almost forgets her. Until now. This is Phoebe's story. The story of a woman who didn't preach to thousands, but whose quiet strength carried the very words that would shape the Christian faith. Let us uncover the legacy of Phoebe, the woman who brought Paul's message to Rome. Small Blue Diamond. The sun dipped low over the bustling port city of Cenchreae, casting golden streaks across the restless waters. Merchants shouted their final bargains, sailors secured their ships, and travelers prepared for long journeys across the empire. Among them stood Phoebe, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, gripping the scroll that would change history. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't an apostle. But tonight, she carried something far more powerful than a sword or a title. She carried Paul's letter to the Romans. The weight of the parchment in her hands was more than just ink and words. It was a message that would shape Christian theology for centuries. It was a declaration of faith, a call to unity, a revelation of grace. And Paul had chosen her, not a trained messenger, not a prominent leader, but Phoebe, a deaconess, a benefactor, a woman of unwavering faith, to deliver it. She took a deep breath, staring at the horizon. The journey ahead was treacherous. Bandits lurked along the roads, Roman officials scrutinized travelers, and the very message she carried could spark opposition. But she didn't hesitate. She had served the church in Cenchreae faithfully, supporting believers, offering refuge, and ensuring that the gospel spread beyond the walls of her home. She had been a pillar of strength, a quiet force behind the movement. And now, she was stepping into history. As she boarded the ship bound for Rome, she whispered a prayer. Lord, let your words reach those who need them. Let this message transform hearts. Let me be your vessel. The sails caught the wind, the ship lurched forward, and Phoebe's mission began. This was more than a journey. This was destiny. The journey to Rome was long and treacherous. Phoebe gripped the scroll tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. The ship rocked gently as the waves carried her toward the heart of the empire, a city of power, politics, and persecution. She wasn't just delivering a letter. She was carrying a message that would shape the future of Christianity. As she stood on the deck, staring at the endless horizon, she thought back to Cenchreae, the city where her faith had flourished. Phoebe wasn't just another believer. She was a deaconess, a leader, a servant, a benefactor. The church in Cenchreae was small but growing, a beacon of hope in a world filled with uncertainty. She had spent years supporting believers, offering refuge, and ensuring that the gospel spread beyond the walls of her home. Paul had seen her dedication firsthand. He had watched her serve tirelessly, giving her resources, her time, her heart to the mission of Christ. And that's why he had chosen her. Not just to carry his letter, but to represent him, to explain his words, to ensure that the Roman believers understood the depth of his message. She wasn't just a messenger. She was an ambassador of faith. The ship docked in Puteoli, a bustling port near Rome. As Phoebe stepped onto solid ground, she knew, this was the beginning of something far greater than herself. She adjusted her cloak, took a deep breath, and walked forward, carrying history in her hands. Her mission was just beginning. The city of Rome was unlike anything Phoebe had ever seen. Towering marble columns stretched toward the sky, casting long shadows over the bustling streets. The scent of fresh bread and roasted meats mingled with the sharp tang of iron from the soldiers' armor. Voices filled the air, merchants bartering, philosophers debating, and officials shouting orders. But Phoebe wasn't here to marvel at the grandeur of the empire. She had a mission. She stepped off the ship, adjusting her cloak as she clutched the scroll tightly against her chest. Paul's letter to the Romans, a message that would shape Christian theology for centuries, was now in her hands, ready to be delivered. She had traveled far, endured sleepless nights, and navigated dangerous roads. But now, standing in the heart of the empire, she felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. Would the believers in Rome accept her? Would they receive Paul's words with open hearts? She had no time for doubt. Phoebe made her way through the crowded streets, her sandals kicking up dust as she walked with purpose. She had been commended by Paul himself, and that meant something. She wasn't just a messenger, she was an ambassador of faith, a leader, a deaconess. She arrived at the home of the Roman believers, knocking firmly on the wooden door. The door creaked open, and a man peered out cautiously. "I bring a letter from Paul," she said, her voice steady. The man's eyes widened. He stepped aside, ushering her in. Inside, the room was filled with believers, men and women gathered in quiet anticipation. Candles flickered, casting warm light over their faces. Phoebe took a deep breath and unrolled the scroll. This was the moment. She began to read. Paul's words echoed through the room, filling the space with truth, conviction, and grace. The believers listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. By the time she finished, silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, they nodded. They understood. They accepted. And just like that, Phoebe had fulfilled her mission. She wasn't just a messenger. She was a vessel for God's word. Phoebe sat in the dimly lit room, the scent of burning oil lamps filling the air. The Roman believers had gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The scroll lay open before her, its words carrying the weight of divine revelation. She had traveled far, endured sleepless nights, and navigated treacherous roads. But now, she was here, in the heart of the empire, delivering Paul's message to the faithful. As she read aloud, the room fell silent. Paul's words were bold, unshaken by fear. He spoke of grace, salvation, and the unity of believers, a message that defied the rigid structures of Roman society. He called for faith that transcended boundaries, for love that shattered divisions. And Phoebe was the one delivering it. She wasn't just a messenger. She was a leader, a deaconess, a benefactor. Paul had commended her not just for carrying his letter, but for her unwavering service to the church. She had supported believers, provided refuge, and ensured that the gospel spread beyond the walls of her home. The Roman believers listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. By the time she finished, silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, they nodded. They understood. They accepted. And just like that, Phoebe had fulfilled her mission. But her work was far from over. She stayed in Rome, offering guidance, answering questions, ensuring that Paul's words were not just read, but understood. She wasn't an apostle. She wasn't a preacher. But she was a force in the early church, a woman whose influence shaped the faith of many. Her legacy was just beginning. Phoebe sat in the quiet room, the parchment spread before her, its edges curling slightly from the journey. The Roman believers had gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of oil lamps. The air was thick with anticipation. This was no ordinary letter. Paul's words carried the weight of divine revelation, a message that would shape Christian theology for centuries. Every sentence was a declaration of faith, a call to unity, a revelation of grace. She took a deep breath and began to read. The room fell silent. Paul spoke of justification by faith, of the righteousness of God revealed through Christ. He dismantled the barriers between Jew and Gentile, calling all to embrace the salvation offered through Jesus. His words were bold, unshaken by fear. Phoebe's voice was steady, unwavering. She wasn't just delivering a letter, she was carrying a revolution. The believers listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. Some nodded, others whispered prayers under their breath. They understood. They accepted. By the time she finished, the silence was profound. Then, one by one, they spoke. Questions. Reflections. Tears. Phoebe answered patiently, explaining Paul's words, ensuring that his message was not just heard, but understood. She wasn't an apostle. She wasn't a preacher. But she was a force in the early church, a woman whose influence shaped the faith of many. Her mission was complete, but her legacy was just beginning. Phoebe had completed her mission. She had delivered Paul's letter to the Roman believers, ensuring that his words that would shape Christian theology for centuries, were received, understood, and embraced. But her journey was far from over. Rome was a city of power, politics, and persecution. The streets were lined with marble columns, the air thick with the scent of burning incense from pagan temples. Every corner held whispers of rebellion, of faith, of fear. Phoebe had stepped into the heart of the empire, not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as a servant. And yet, her influence was undeniable. She wasn't just a messenger. She was a deaconess, a leader, a benefactor. She had supported believers, provided refuge, and ensured that the gospel spread beyond the walls of her home. She had been a pillar of strength in Cenchreae, and now, she was a beacon of hope in Rome. The Roman believers welcomed her, offering her a place among them. She wasn't just passing through. She was here to stay, to serve, to lead. She spent her days teaching, mentoring, guiding. She answered questions about Paul's letter, explaining its meaning, ensuring that his message was not just read, but lived. She visited the homes of believers, offering encouragement, sharing meals, praying over families. She was a quiet force, moving through the city with purpose, with conviction, with unwavering faith. But Rome was dangerous. Persecution loomed over the early church like a storm cloud, threatening to silence the voices of those who dared to follow Christ. Believers were arrested, imprisoned, executed. Phoebe knew the risks. And yet, she did not retreat. She stood alongside the Roman believers, offering strength in their darkest moments. She provided shelter for those in hiding, comfort for those in mourning, hope for those in despair. The streets of Rome were alive with movement, chariots rattling over stone roads, merchants shouting their wares, and Roman soldiers marching in disciplined formations. The scent of burning incense from pagan temples lingered in the air, mixing with the aroma of fresh bread from street vendors. Phoebe walked through the city with purpose, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She had fulfilled her mission, delivering Paul's letter to the Roman believers, but her work was far from over. She had stepped into the heart of the empire, not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as a servant. And yet, her influence was undeniable. The Roman believers welcomed her, offering her a place among them. She wasn't just passing through, she was here to stay, to serve, to lead. She spent her days teaching, mentoring, guiding. She answered questions about Paul's letter, explaining its meaning, ensuring that his message was not just read, but lived. She visited the homes of believers, offering encouragement, sharing meals, praying over families. She was a quiet force, moving through the city with purpose, with conviction, with unwavering faith. But Rome was dangerous. Persecution loomed over the early church like a storm cloud, threatening to silence the voices of those who dared to follow Christ. Believers were arrested, imprisoned, executed. Phoebe knew the risks. And yet, she did not retreat. She stood alongside the Roman believers, offering strength in their darkest moments. She provided shelter for those in hiding, comfort for those in mourning, hope for those in despair. Phoebe had come to Rome as a messenger, but she stayed as a leader. Her name might not have been spoken from the grand podiums of the empire, but her impact echoed through the early church, a quiet force that strengthened, nurtured, and encouraged believers to stand firm in their faith. The persecution intensified. Believers were forced into hiding, gathering in secret, whispering prayers in the safety of candlelit rooms. Some were arrested, some imprisoned, some martyred. And yet, the church did not fall. Phoebe, ever steadfast, continued her work. She moved among the believers, offering guidance, sharing Paul's words, ensuring that the gospel was not only understood, but lived. She had carried Paul's letter, but now, she carried the believers themselves, lifting them with her wisdom, shielding them with her faith, fortifying them with her presence. Over time, Rome became a place not just of persecution, but of transformation. The faith that had once been whispered in darkened rooms would one day be proclaimed in the streets. The message Phoebe carried, the letter she had delivered, would outlive kingdoms, emperors, and centuries. And her name, though often overlooked, remained woven into the very fabric of Christian history. Phoebe wasn't an apostle. She wasn't a warrior. She was a woman with unwavering faith, a servant who changed the course of Christianity through quiet obedience. Her mission was complete. But her legacy was eternal. Faith is not measured by the grandness of one's name, but by the depth of one's impact. And Phoebe's impact remains. Phoebe's story reminds us that true impact isn't always loud, it's steadfast, faithful, and unwavering. She wasn't an apostle, yet Paul trusted her with one of the most important missions in Christian history. She didn't stand in the spotlight, yet her service helped build the foundations of the early church. Her legacy isn't one of fame, it's one of faithfulness. And now, her story challenges us. Are you ready to follow in Phoebe's footsteps? Carry the message, just as Phoebe carried Paul's letter, share the gospel with those around you. Serve with purpose, use your gifts to strengthen and encourage others in faith. Support the church, be a benefactor of ministry, offering time, resources, or wisdom. Live out the gospel, don't just read the words, live them, embody them, spread them. Let's keep the conversation going. Share how Phoebe's story has inspired you, and how you plan to walk in faith, just as she did. Your mission begins today. Go and make an impact.